I'm really looking forward to hearing from our next presenter, Dr. Janina Grabs, who will be speaking to us about changes to the legislative landscape. So one major novelty is the emergence of due diligence regulation, which puts an increasing responsibility on companies to understand, prevent, and combat adverse social and environmental impacts in their value chains. The way these regulations are written, the onus is usually on buyers to comply, but many sellers are rightly concerned about what these changes are going to mean to them and about what unintended consequences might look like. These are big questions, and we're fortunate to have guidance from Dr. Grabs on this. She is an assistant professor of business and society in the Department of Society, Politics, and Sustainability at ESADE Business School in Barcelona. Her work focuses on the governance of sustainability on global value chains, and there's a special focus in her work on tropical agricultural commodities, such as coffee and palm oil. She'll be drawing on that work for today's presentation. Welcome, Janina.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be participating in this. So I think we have some slides that might be pulled up now for my presentation. Is that correct? Yes, there we go. They're coming on. So let me just say it's been really fascinating to see the development of these types of legislations from this academic perspective. I do a lot of firsthand research on how this is going to play out. And so I'd like to bring you some perspective, some insights from that work today. And I'll focus both on giving you, first of all, a broad introduction to this topic of due diligence legislations, just in case, so we're all on the same page. Then we'll focus on one specific one that has captured a lot of attention in the sector, which is the EU Deforestation Regulation. And I'll do two things. On the first, as a first point, I'll draw on my work in the palm oil sector, which has had some experience in trying to create deforestation-free value chains, to sketch out some possible scenarios that we might see in the future in the coffee sector. And then I'll also draw on work that was very recent. I conducted a whole range of interviews with coffee stakeholders to understand where their minds are at in terms of how the sector is responding. So we'll get both a view into the past for possible pathways, as well as a view into the present moment. So as Kim Elena mentioned, we have this wide range of supply chain due diligence laws that are emerging, particularly in the European Union, also in North America and in Australia, so broadly the global north. And the idea is that companies sourcing from around the world, but also and predominantly including the global south, should show more responsibility for possible adverse and environmental and social impacts, should understand what those impacts are, should mitigate them, should try to remove negative impacts from their supply chains, and also in some cases provide remedy to affected victims. So broadly, we can talk about three types of legislation in this field. The first one, and the one that came earliest, is what we call disclosure-only legislation. And disclosure-only legislation really asks businesses to understand better and disclose their impacts. But it doesn't necessarily require them to do anything differently in terms of their practices and how to address those impacts. So here the idea would be that via this transparency, stakeholders are given more insights. There's also a possibility of sort of naming and shaming of bad actors or the recognition of good ones. Then the second category, disclosure, due diligence, and remediation legislation. This is what's now been on the table, especially in the European Union and its member states. Here, the idea is that a company really does an entire exercise of mapping out what are all of the areas of negative social and environmental impact that its operations and its supply chains might be having, that it formulates a plan how to address each and every one of those impacts, and that here again, there is remediation as an important component of this. So businesses may then also be held liable in court or may held liable via regulators if they, in order for them to sort of provide remedies for affected victims of harms that have already taken place. And then the third type of legislation that I want to introduce today in a bit of detail is what we call trade-based legislation, which kind of takes the idea or the aim of due diligence, but translates it into a legislation that really focuses on imports specifically. And so here the idea would be that companies are banned from importing certain goods that are associated with certain bad environmental or social practices. And the Deforestation Regulation is an example of that kind of legislation. But just to give a little bit more insight, if you are inclined to get a more detailed overview of what has been happening in the recent 2-3 years, what I've been working on with support of the European Union, the European Commission, and also in collaboration with the International Coffee Organization, is to provide a full overview of the specific legislations that have been proposed. Some of those have not yet been passed, but others have been passed and are now on the way of being implemented. So I'll give you a very brief summary of what this database contains, but at the end of the presentation, I'll show you a link to where you can see it, work with it, interact with it. We have an interactive online platform that contains all of this information, and also feel free to reach out later if you want to have sort of the Excel version of this. So just in terms of providing this broad overview, the disclosure legislations, what I was talking about, where businesses basically need to report what is happening. This came to the fore specifically with a focus on modern slavery. And so this has been focusing in the UK and Australia and Canada. There's been also, on a broader spectrum, reporting requirements that are focusing on the broad array of environmental, social, and governance disclosures. This has been more the case in the EU and also in Switzerland. And in the UK, companies also are required to think more about how their activities impact the climate and how they have climate-related risks and opportunities. Then when we go to the due diligence legislation, here again, what we have is quite a wide array. This has really been a European advancement. So we don't have as many actors from other buying countries that are putting these types of broad due diligence on the table. But what we see in the European Union, which is quite interesting, is that it started out with single company legislation. So first France, now Germany, and also Norway already have this type of legislation in place. And now there's a big movement to create a holistic framework at the European Union level with what's called the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So here the details are still being hammered out, but that is most likely going to be adopted next year and would then come into force with another year or two's time. And then finally, we'll talk more in detail about the Deforestation Regulation, which is this trade-based legislation. But also, interestingly, we see a number of countries, both in North America and Australia, imposing trade restrictions also on goods associated with forced labor. And in the case of Canada, also goods associated with child labor. So those would also be prohibited from being imported. And so here, the customs authority is the one who checks and who may then confiscate shipments at the border. So quite an interesting development on that side. There's also, this is maybe less specific to the coffee sector, but quite a lot of work done to specifically target the Xinjiang region in China, where there's been reports of modern slavery within the Uyghur minority. And so US and Canadian legislators have also focused a lot on that. But let's focus now on the Deforestation Regulation. So this was a legislation that had a very long history, but then a very fast implementation time. Really within a little over a year, we had a final text that has been adopted last June, and that will now will be enforced. Companies will have to act upon it within 18 months of that adoption, so by December 2025. And December 2024, so now in a year's time. Small and medium businesses have a little bit more of a time frame. And so what the deforestation regulation asks is that companies know and prevent any type of goods that have been associated with deforestation, which they define as forests being cleared after the cutoff date of the end of the year 2020. So if any agricultural commodity amongst the 6 that are in this legislation, which includes coffee, are produced on land that was deforested after this date, that commodity would be ineligible to be imported into the market. And so it doesn't matter whether that was legal or illegal deforestation according to the country laws in question. Here, the question is, was this a forest and was it cut down? So it includes both types of deforestation. The way that this is checked is that companies are asked to provide GPS points or polygons, depending on the size of the supplier, of every single piece of land upon which a product that is in a specific shipment was produced. So here, really what is being asked of companies is much more granular traceability down to individual plots in order to be able to provide this type of information to legislators, who will then be able to check to what extent that particular piece of land is in or out of scope in terms of the legislation. There's agri-forestry, which might be interesting to talk about, is considered agriculture. So also converting a native forest into agroforestry land after 2020 would be included in this type of legislation. But on the other hand, if there's already existing agroforestry systems, they would not be considered forest, right? And so if in those existing systems, they would be considered as an agricultural surface, and the EU wouldn't check on deforestation patterns in those areas. There's what happens when companies don't comply. There's a wide range of possible punishments that are included in the legislation, and the most stringent or the most concerning for some companies is that the maximum fine, the fine for the maximum level of non-compliance, if the company really shows that it didn't comply, can be up to as high as 4% of the total turnover in that particular year, which means that that is quite a hefty punishment. And so other possible punitive measures can also include that the particular authority that is implementing this may confiscate the shipment, confiscate the money that was made with a particular shipment, or that companies that are non-compliant may not be allowed to be present and do business in the EU market. So quite a wide range of measures. Which of those it will basically depend on how every single member state implements and will sort of define those punitive measures for themselves. So what does this mean for companies that are within the scope of this? We already said very high levels of traceability, quite important transparency over their supply chains. Right now, it is not sufficient to have vague knowledge or to use mass balance approaches or anything like this. It really needs to be known who the original farmer is that has been supplying this shipment, and that particular shipment needs to be able to be traced all the way to the market. That also means, right, that companies have a much more deep level of understanding of their suppliers, of also potential issues with their suppliers, and especially when concerning sort of broader due diligence measures, but also within the case of the deforestation regulation, there is the idea that companies would also help provide support for suppliers in order to be able to meet these standards, right? And so implications for small producers, or I mean, I could say any producer, but there's been many concerns of what does it mean for smallholder farmers. Of course, farmers themselves are not being legislated in the sense, they're not in the scope, but it might mean that they're getting many more demands on information because companies that are being held to account by this legislation require such information. So that may mean that particular traceability information may be needed. It also may be that cooperatives or farmer groups are being asked to provide much more detailed information on how specific sub-shipments, right, were flowing from specific producers. In the broader due diligence framework, there may also be other types of issues of concern that people, specifically buyers, may raise, right? So issues surrounding labor conditions on the ground, issues concerning the environment. But I also want to highlight that particularly when it comes to the wider range of due diligence measures, there are also important benefits, especially for suppliers that felt that they were unduly harmed by buying companies, right, by companies, because the whole reason for this type of legislation is to hold buying companies more accountable. And so there may be possible access to remedies that didn't exist before. And so how will this happen in practice? Again, the sector, coffee is one of the 6 sectors that this regulation, the deforestation regulation, affects, has been given 18 months to move into compliance. And another sector that is also being targeted here that has some interesting insights is the palm oil sector, because here, because palm has been such a big driver of deforestation, especially in the tropics, before this mandatory legislation came into force, there's been quite some voluntary commitments, such so-called no deforestation, no peat exploitation, no peat development, and no exploitation policies that companies have made in the palm oil sector that basically promised from their own accord to eliminate deforestation in their supply chains in a very similar way as now this mandatory legislation asks of them. So we can take a peek in the past of how companies have fared with these types of commitments to see where the future, particularly of coffee and other types of commodities that haven't had as strong of a voluntary focus on this issue, may have. So there's 5 scenarios that I want to introduce. And I will say that these 5 scenarios, I've seen all of them play out in this palm oil sector in various, like with various companies taking the lead, right? So it's also not necessarily the case that only one happens or not the other, but these are basically ways in which companies can now start to act. And the first way is that they really start to mitigate risk by streamlining their supply chain, by making it much more focused on very few suppliers with which they work much more in detail, with from whom they may be sourcing higher volumes, and eliminate or move away from other suppliers for which they may not have as much information, or they may not be as clear about whether or not there may be some risky behavior in their eyes, for instance, of deforestation occurring. And so an example of a company that did this in the palm oil case is Mars, quite this large food and beverage company that moved from over 1,500 palm oil mills that they were sourcing from to only 100. And they had this goal of moving to even only 50. And they said that this was very useful because that gave them much more stronger relationships with the suppliers that they continue to have. And they had also more leverage over those suppliers in terms of being able to help them, but also ask specific practices of them because they were sourcing a higher volume. Of course, the critique of that type of approach is that it may end up eliminating and excluding particularly the areas where there's most concern, and it may also be excluding actors that are not non-compliant, that are not risky, but where there's just very little information available. And so specifically in sort of the smallholder segment, that might very well be the case, right? So in that sense, if there's a large number of companies that are moving into this type of approach of just funneling down to very, very few suppliers, we may expect political opposition by coffee-producing countries and the smallholder organizations within them. What we may also see then is that there is increased competition over those specific high-performing providers, right, that can get that type of information out for them. So we may see sort of a focusing and a competition over plantations and advanced cooperatives that were able to provide these types of elements. That could also then lead to better prices for those particular types of frontrunners. The second scenario is that companies stick with their current supply chains, but make quite high company-specific investments to actually maintain and gain traceability all the way down to smallholder farmers, right? That they roll out concerted efforts and scale up efforts that have existed in the past of trying to enroll specifically farmers into specific programs and get much more granular data on them. Some companies in Palm did this as well, and they did this because they saw it as a competitive advantage to be one of the companies with the best overall visibility of their supply chain, right? So they were able to sort of like get ahead. And even in a case of this mandatory regulation, we can still expect that there may be potentially some competitive advantage to be the first one out of the gate that is meeting all of these standards, and that basically can then set the stage, set the bar for everybody else. So what we could think about here is maybe also, again, sort of the use of like quite numerous technical support, like teams of technical support organizations that are going out in the field and mapping smallholder farmers, gathering these GPS points. We could also think of potentially blockchain technologies being developed to provide this better type of traceability. The challenge, though, is even if you've done this effort once and it is very costly, keeping it up to date is not self-evident, right? Because especially in smallholder market structures, you may not be selling to the same person today and tomorrow. You may not be always sort of like using the same strategy. And so if this were sort of the path forward, it would require continuous improvement and continuous effort to keep these kind of data systems up to date, which might take away, right, a lot of resources from other types of approaches, which could help people on the ground pursue more environmentally sustainable measures. And of course, there's also this issue that if we're seeing this from a competitive sense, we will have a lot of duplication from different companies that are mapping the same farmers multiple times, everybody coming with their own system, with their own strategy, and that the burden also on specifically cooperatives and individual farmer groups is going to be very high in providing this type of information. The third scenario would be that one could also look for alternative levels of traceability, sort of good enough, by saying it's unreasonable to expect this level of traceability down to smallholders because it'll never be completely accurate. It's wasting a lot of resources that we could use for better practices. And what we want to see is to what extent certain regions are doing well or not, right? So we could also think about linking this type of traceability more to, for instance, jurisdictional approaches that have emerged. So this was sort of one of the innovations that happened quite late in the Palm case, that they're thinking about, let's use like regions or landscapes as sort of the locus of attention, and we can then also engage alongside other companies to try to improve practices in that particular landscape. The challenge, of course, of that type of approach, again, is twofold. On the one hand, in contrast to these voluntary measures where companies had some leeway to reinterpret what their pledge meant, this is legally binding regulation. So there would need to be a lot of footwork done at the European Union level to try to convince legislators to use that alternative type of interpretation of the legislation, which may be quite difficult. And even if that were possible, it does also introduce a wide range of collective action problems, right, in terms of the question, what happens if there's only very few producers that are deforesting? Does everybody get punished? What happens if there's deforestation that is not coming from the particular commodity in question, but from other types of activities like mining? How can we separate those two out? So although taking a little bit of a higher level approach may seem easier in practice, it raises other types of complications. The fourth scenario would be that companies come together and collaborate and see this legal compliance as a fully pre-competitive measure, right? So an idea that they're not going to compete on this. It's in everybody's best interest to come together to gather this information. They can divvy up the work of doing that, and also divvy up sort of how different companies may actually, reach out to farmers and support them in order to make sure that everybody's supply chains are clean of deforestation. So this happened in palm, specifically in companies that used palm oil derivatives, so cosmetics companies, for instance, that were so far removed from the ground that it was very difficult for them to even get information who they were sourcing from. And so they went through this an NGO that allowed them to pool data without being accused of being of colluding, and therefore increase their efficiency quite a bit. The challenge here is if, again, there's a sort of like a collective, possibly open source data platform, what happens to the data of the farmers, right? How can we ensure privacy? Can farmers still own the data? This is also an issue that that, of course, does not only apply to this pre-competitive measures, but also to companies individually collecting farmer-level data. Who is benefiting from that data, and how farmers can also benefit from it is like a huge question. It's still causing a lot of debate. And of course, if there's multiple actors that are all contributing, it may be a little bit more difficult to figure out who is finally responsible for the accuracy and how to divvy up this type of the type of additions that people are doing in a fair way. Finally, and we've seen this also in palm, of course, another scenario that we could imagine is the compliance at the lowest possible cost, and specifically on paper compliance rather than in practice compliance, and ways to try to get around regulations in a way that still allows for the right data points to show up alongside shipments, but that those data points may not necessarily be the ones that all of the coffee is coming from. So fudging this way in order to maintain the status quo, of course, also has challenges. Namely, I already mentioned the quite strict penalties in case this type of behavior is caught. Of course, it also creates reputational risks for companies, especially because we can expect that there's also going to be local NGOs and international NGOs that will follow up on companies' performance in producing countries as well. So where do we see it go now? Because we're still at such an early stage, I can only give you a couple of insights that come from these 58 interviews that I've done over the last summer. I'm hoping to do another round this summer to see how the landscape has changed since then. But this was the time when the legislation came into force. Companies realized they have 18 months to come into compliance, and that they have very little time and need to put in a lot of resources to achieve this task, right? So the first thing that I would take away from these interviews is that this has created, to a large extent, a deforestation tunnel vision, where this regulation is the one that everybody now focuses on meeting. But as I told you in the first part of my presentations, there's many more focusing on forced labor, on child labor, on much broader human rights and environmental impacts that will be also, that some of which are already in force and some of which will be coming into force soon. So I would first of all make sure that people don't only focus on this one over others. Secondly, and this is maybe, this has been a tenor throughout sort of the talks that I've had with people. There was a big concern that even as the regulation was being passed, that was being specified on paper, there was still a big mismatch in what was expected of the sector and how the sector works in reality. So there was quite some confusion, some hesitancy, and also a realization that there were still some questions that were so unclear that companies were not sure whether they're following the right approach in the plans that they were making. So in that sense, what we saw happening in the first, I would say, 6 months has been a lot of overwhelm and a lot of sort of this idea of sticking the head in the sand, maybe not even thinking too much about it, because there is so many things that would need to happen, and the task is basically impossible to achieve. So there are some companies that are basically sort of just sitting back and seeing to what extent it will be feasible for anybody to achieve this in practice, and also expecting that maybe there will be some additional adjustments happening in due course as the legislators realize that this may be an impossible task. But at the same time, there have been a lot of initial intentions and initial ideas bandied around. And what we see so far is basically that there's a parallel track, a dual track system emerging that is sitting between the single company action and the collective action in terms of actually using it as taking it as a pre-competitive measure. And what is happening is that there are a lot of organizations, including the International Coffee Organization, but also the Global Coffee Platform, also other more national level organizations like the European Coffee Federation, that have tried to engage, tried to figure out how could they provide frameworks for actors to come together, and what type of issues would that happen best, right? There was quite a lot of work done on just trying to figure out what types of data and how the data should look that would eventually be shared between individual actors to make sure that there's compatibility on that ground. But there's also now been talks of trying to create an integrated open source digital public infrastructure, in a sense that this would be sort of this open source platform that would also have a producer-facing app that producers could use to gather and upload data of the type that companies might need. This is still a work in progress, and what's been quite interesting is that a lot of actors are participating in this, or at least are sitting at the table, but at the same time may still be pursuing their own individual company efforts. And so to what extent they will eventually then also put money and resources into the pre-competitive platforms may be a little bit of a function of to what extent those individual efforts have worked well enough for them. There's large concerns over cheating, especially given the fact that companies are pointing out various places where you might interpret the legislation one way or another, in terms of them having sort of the requirements of uploading the data individually, right, and sort of making sure that that data is correct. There's been a number of actors that have been pointing out that this might be an easy way to fudge compliance for actors that do not want to put in the resources of being extremely accurate, and it's going to be difficult for the regulators to check whether or not one particular data point or GPS point really correlates with that particular coffee bean or coffee shipment. So there's quite a large concern over this, and also a concern that if a large number of actors would move into that sort of comply on paper but not in practice perspective, it'll again create unfair competition for those who are trying to do it properly. And finally, two more concerns that were highlighted quite a bit is that this type of box ticking mindset has led companies to focus very much on sort of being compliant and sort of taking a little bit of a interest and engagement away from some more innovative approaches that they may have been pursuing before. The concern over compliance is understandable given these very high possible penalties. So I've also heard from actors saying that, especially for a trading organization, 4% of turnover could wipe out basically their entire profits in a year. That could make them non-viable in the long run. So here there is a strong concern with trying to make sure that everybody is in line, but that also creates concerns over one of the pathways that I was pointing out at the beginning, this idea that there are actors that are now focusing in on a specific, more advanced supply chain and may leave out other types of actors, such as smallholders, because of this risk reward understanding that they would rather reduce the risk. The last thing that I will say is that there's also concerns that all of these measures are going to increase industry consolidation even more, and maybe most difficult for the smaller actors to understand and how to comply and to comply with it. So it might increase consolidation amongst roasters, amongst trading companies, and also amongst producers. So of course, we can't see into the future. What will happen remains to be seen. I, from my perspective, would encourage an inclusive, equitable, collaborative, and also far-sighted approach, especially given the fact that this will not be the only issue on the table over the next couple of years. And that's all from me. I'm really happy to see whether there's any questions in the audience and other types of concerns that may come up.
Thank you so much. Janina, that was great. Very comprehensive, as someone said in the chat. And yeah, don't worry, there are plenty of questions and also a bunch of comments in the chat. So I'm going to leave your slides up for just another second in case people want to note down your contact info, and then I'll take them down, and we can fill the whole screen with our faces while we talk. So I had a couple of questions for you that I wanted to put out there before getting into the questions from the audience, and one of those was just, I have seen you speak a couple of times on a couple of different sustainability related topics over the years. And I wondered how long you've been involved in researching, the legislative landscape, and especially this, deforestation regulation that has really accelerated the conversation that we're having kind of in industry circles about this. Has this been something that you've been doing for a while, or is this, did you get into this more recently?
So I've basically just gone with the flow on what has been happening. So I've always been interested in sustainability governance of the coffee sector specifically, starting from my PhD. But what I focused on mostly then was private regulation via certification schemes. And again, these due diligence requirements. So I started working on this like maybe a year and a half ago. I am a political scientist by training. So it's actually quite funny because I was always sort of at the edge of the discipline because there was so little happening in the public policy arena that I was studying how business made rules for the most part. And so it has been very interesting to see how now legislators have been trying to approach this. So it's still quite a new research agenda for me, but one that I want to pursue over the next couple of years in a lot more depth as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that leads me to something else I was thinking about while you were talking, which is, you alluded to, I think it was like an open source sort of resource on reporting, and reading the news this week about the COP28, or I think that's the right number. And some of the big news was about the agreement, reconciliation of reporting frameworks that have been separate. And I wondered if that's part of this shift from sustainability being voluntary to sustainability being legislated. Do you anticipate that we might see more of that reconciliation and less competition between frameworks in the future?
Absolutely, right? I think as legislators have now come on board, it's become more and more important for businesses to do exactly the right thing. like report exactly the right number, and there's less wiggle room for them to argue that one or the other framework could be more suitable. And we actually, it's quite interesting, we see this in this negotiation over the deforestation regulation as well, that there are now some frameworks or some initiatives that are basically being left a little bit behind because the regulators wouldn't commit to them. So for instance, in the palm oil sector, they spent almost a decade to develop this high carbon stock concept that defined forests that needed to be remaining standing. And this legislation now uses the FAO's definition of a forest, meaning that they're incompatible. And many times legislators have, at least I've heard, that they're perceived to be quite recalcitrant in terms of adding in sort of like industry advances, especially as if there is sort of an international organization standard that also exists.
Yeah. I know that like I said, there are a lot of sort of comments and a lot of people who have been paying attention to this for a while who have strong feelings about it, but we also have a couple of really practical questions that I want to make sure that we get a chance to ask you. One of them is about from Stefan, is who is allowed to certify the geographical coordinates of the coffee in a shipment? And he goes on to give an example. This person goes on to give an example saying, in a shared container from several co-ops with diverse group of smallholder coffee farmers / lots, who is in legislative legal terms responsible, accountable of providing the necessary information to comply with the legislation? Importer, trader, roaster, co-op, all.
Yeah. So the legal responsibility over the accuracy lies with what's in the EU's, like usually it lies specifically with what the EU calls the operator, which is the company that moves the item through customs. So most of the time that will be the trading company, but sometimes I've also heard of roasters that are actually, clearing customs. But in addition, companies that take and use this shipment further, for instance, roasters within the European Union, they also have a duty, but they will be able to sort of just link to whatever the first operator was specifying in their statement. So my understanding is that the broadest responsibility lies on that particular operator.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they will need to make sure that they're getting the most accurate information possible.
Yeah. That gets to another question that I think you kind of just answered, but I want to make sure that that we're clear on it. Christine asks, which coffees apply for this regulation? Is it like all coffee from the retail, like coffee shops, instant coffee? Like where's the sort of, what kind of coffee are we talking about?
Yeah, it is a great question because it applies first and foremost to green coffee that is being imported, but also so the legislation talks about commodities and then specific processed products from the commodity. And so roasted coffee is included in that appendix. Instant coffee is not. So that's been quite a concern for some people within the market that also see that there is now again, sort of like possible competitive implications of this if the instant coffees will not be subject to the same requirements as the rest.
Yeah. Another, I think, practical question that came up when you were talking about the publication here was so the publication or release is curated by who? That's a question from Vera.
Sorry, the publication of what?
Yeah, maybe I didn't note this down. I just copied the question. So maybe, Vera, if you're still watching and you can put in the chat, I'll make sure that I'm looking at both screens at the same time. Okay, one more practical question. Who is allowed to certify the geographical coordinates of a coffee in a shipment?
Yeah. As far as I understand, so these are like sort of these small specificities that are still being debated. As far as I understand, there doesn't need to be a certification of the GPS point in question. What the operator needs to provide is the GPS point, and then that will then be used by by the specific authorities. Of course, there is now a question on specifically like certified coffees themselves. It's been quite clear by the Commission that certification of the product doesn't provide like a green lane around this, but to some extent it might be useful. And it may be that in the future reiterations, we see more specific guidelines around how to prove the veracity of that GPS point. I don't think that that's been decided yet.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for extrapolating or expanding a little bit on what you said earlier. One of the things that I was curious to hear your thoughts on, given that this is, the Specialty Coffee Association and sort of a specialty coffee audience, is I have perceived, and I've heard this from, people kind of looking at specialty and wondering how involved specialty coffee is going to be in this, wondering whether or not specialty coffee roasters, say, or buyers who may have more traceability with some lots or most lots of coffee. Are we involved enough in this? Are roasters are specialty roasters of all sizes, but maybe especially small roasters, paying enough attention, taking this seriously? Or, do you perceive that specialty is kind of expecting that this is not going to apply to our businesses as much because they're small, because we know the name of the producer? Is there sort of a disconnect there between our sense of how this applies to us and what the law is going to say we are accountable for?
Right. I mean, I'd love to turn the question back at you, right? But my sense is that there may be a sense of false security, right? That having direct trade, or as good as direct trade, of course, will be helpful, but there's still it's still useful to be up to date on those specific requirements, and make sure that what a particular company considers full traceability actually matches what the EU means when it says full traceability, right? Especially, again, what I think there's been quite a lot of concern in the coffee sector specifically is that many times companies will have full traceability to cooperatives, and they know the producers within those cooperatives, but that is still not enough in theory. So what I've heard people specifying, right, or like saying is that, okay, we'll just map out all of the GPS points of all of the producers in that particular cooperative. So there would be oversupplying data, right? Let's say not every producer sold during this particular harvest period to the cooperative. Like there's some that are members but didn't sell this season. If you then sort of put all of those producers into the database that will be associated with that shipment, if you have a producer that did deforest, whose coffee wasn't actually in the shipment, you'll still be held liable because you said that was sort of the data that it was coming from, right? So there's also quite a fine line in terms of trying to make these types of requirements a little bit more feasible by over-reporting. But then, of course, if you're expanding it massively, you're also just increasing risk in that sense.
Yeah. From my perspective, everything you just said resonates with me. And my hope is, for people who are tuning in today and maybe not super familiar with this ahead of time, that the reminder to check or not to make those assumptions that the data you have is the data that you're going to be asked for, would be a really good starting point for that kind of awareness, and also to avoid falling into the deforestation tunnel vision, as you called it. I think that's that also resonates with how I've seen the energy around the conversation growing in this particular piece of legislation just massively over the past couple of years, while, as you said, there are a lot of really similar things happening that aren't specific to deforestation. A question that came up from Luis, he points out that one issue that comes to mind for public databases are the privacy issues for individual farmers. For some of them, this may imply security or other types of risks. Any thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is a key concern, right? And there's big questions around how are we going to create that massive amount of data, and data that is really down to an individual producer without sharing information that is firstly maybe not necessary to actually solve the problem, or that might be necessary, but it's just too private, it's too personal. There have been ideas around giving farmers particular identification numbers, for instance, that wouldn't necessarily correspond to their name. But of course, the GPS point in and of itself has to be of the farm and not of the home. But still, I completely understand, and I would signal that this is an issue that needs to be thought through when these types of platforms are being developed. And I think it also speaks to a broader issue, right? That as companies are implementing this legislation, it has been a very top-down process, starting from the European Commission and legislators down to individual buyers, and now it's being pushed through again in very similar ways to like sustainability requirements that we've seen pushed through to others. And the challenge with creating, there are some initial attempts or conversations that I can recall that talk about, okay, we need to make sure that the farmers are owning this data. We need to make sure that there's a positive, active buy-in. That requires time to develop these models. And my concern right now is that it's like a race to the finish line of making sure that something exists that will provide compliance in a year's time. And depending on if then there are these alternative platforms that are, much more conscientious, but that have developed slower, it'll be a question mark to what extent they can then still keep up with maybe other types of approaches that different large industry actors have sort of converged on. We'll have to see, but I would definitely try to keep that on the top of the agenda.
Yeah. You mentioned this idea of, like an identification number. Mm-hmm. And over the past couple of years, I feel like I've seen a lot or listened to a lot of producing countries, like at the International Coffee Organization, at the national level, expressing a lot of frustration about, this legislation and how it was developed and introduced, the top-down nature of it. I wonder, though, because you're closer to it, whether at the subnational level, or maybe even an institution, are there any examples of, producing country, whether institutions or cooperatives, or that are developing these tools that might put a producer organization in the position to be one of those, I forget what you called them, but kind of a little bit more competitive, or to use the information as an advantage or a positive attribute, as someone commented in the chat. Do you see any examples of that on the ground that come to mind?
I mean, it's a good question whether there's a lot of bottom up. So there is definitely sort of bottom up initiative. So I was recently at an event in Germany where there was a number of possible solutions being suggested. One came from the regional platform of the Global Coffee Platform. They sort of these regional hubs. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was in Kenya where they were showcasing that they have a traceability system that at a national level they're trying to develop. To what extent that is farmer forward or not, or whether it's the government taking responsibility, remains to be seen. There's also the GIZ, the German Development Cooperation. They've created an app that's called INA Trace, which initially, as I understand it, was basically just to be able to provide specialty coffee and specialty product producers the way to create sort of better traceability for their own purposes, to also have sort of this the face of the farmer that is being presented to consumers. I think it's based on blockchain technology, and they have now put that forward as a potential solution as well. Here again, it would require a lot of collaboration between producers as well as their buyers to sort of make sure that everybody is adopting that, right? So yeah, again, there are sort of like these like seeds of innovation that exist. I haven't necessarily seen, there's now that platform that I mentioned that may be a little bit larger, but again, quite northern driven in that sense.
Yeah. Okay, I think we probably have time for just about one more question. And Cassie asked about this is a tough one, but again, trying to, get the practical stuff too, is the cost of compliance, maybe any examples from palm oil that you might have. And I like this question because I do want to, take advantage, if we can, of the fact that you have studied a sector that has been through something, like what we're going through right now.
I mean, so like a cost of like $1 per ton of shipment, I can't necessarily give you that off the top of my head. What I have seen in palm was that it was initially expected to be extremely expensive, and there are industries of scale if there are more and more actors that are sharing information and more actors that have been committing to the same thing. So in that sense, I do think that having a legislative requirement can be useful, right? Because it pushes everybody into the same boat in a sense, such that costs may be shared, especially if these types of pre-competitive measures would happen.